Hey there! Let's have some fun aging some paper without waiting a century. For this craft, that is super easy and will in no way leave your house smelling like burnt coffee, this is what you're gonna need. An oven-proof pan like a cookie sheet, parchment paper, measuring cups, foam brushes or a sponge, paper towel, a heat gun, dryer or oven, and of course paper, I use 24-pound paper, coffee and or tea, and fire. I began this little paper aging experiment by boiling some water. I then combined 1 tablespoon of instant coffee with 1 cup of boiling water. I also steeped a tea bag in a cup of water for 5 minutes. Meanwhile, because the coffee and tea needed to cool down, I decided it would be fun to try a couple of the other aging methods I read about. One method used lime or lemon juice and a heat gun to brown the edges of the paper. For whatever reason, I could not get this method to work for me. I even put a lime juice soaked page in the oven to no avail. I'm no expert, and while the heat gun did brown a small spot on the edge, I couldn't help but feel I either was doing something very wrong or this technique wasn't effective. I also tried lemon juice, which was equally disappointing. So I moved on to burning the paper instead. I strongly suggest you do this technique over a sink or even outside and in a very well ventilated area. Oh, and also be an adult, or have adult supervision. We are playing with fire here. While the fire did create some fun effects to the edge of the paper, I wondered if it would work better to add detail after using one of the other techniques I'll be showing you. I also read that you could crumple up some paper and bury it in soil outside for 3 to 14 days, but, maybe not. I decided that technique wasn't for me. For the next aging techniques, you'll want to preheat your oven to 200 degrees. Grab one of your pans and lay a sheet of paper on the pan. You can use parchment paper under the paper if you want. Now that our coffee is cooled down and we're not going to burn ourselves, we can have some real fun. Pour a little bit of coffee onto the paper, you don't need a whole lot, and spread it over the sheet with a foam brush or sponge. Then take some paper towel or an old towel and soak up the excess coffee. You don't want any puddles or the paper won't dry. You can also tear the edges or poke holes in the paper at this point to achieve the look you want. Or you can crumple the paper prior to staining it with the coffee. Experiment to see which effects give you the look you want. Then toss the pan and paper into the oven for around 5 minutes. Check the paper periodically, it could take around 4 to 7 minutes for the paper to dry. I also found if I used parchment paper, it took the sheet longer to dry in the oven. If you don't have access to an oven, you can also dry the paper with a heat gun or hair dryer. Or set the paper in the sun to dry. On a side note, be careful if your pan has any markings on it because it will leave a mark on the paper. I use the parchment paper to avoid leaving Betty Crocker marks all over my paper. You can crumple the paper before or after the staining and drying process, but I think it looked more natural if it was done prior to adding the stain. You can also write on the paper beforehand. However, I would be cautious because depending on what kind of ink you use, it could bleed when the liquid is applied. And yes, you can write on it after as well. At this point, I also attempted the fire technique on the coffee-stained paper. I felt this was a better use of the fire to create interesting effects on the edges of the paper. And now my house smelt like a combination of burnt paper and coffee. Wonderful. The tea stain worked the same as the coffee. Pour on the tea and spread it over the paper. However, I found the tea did not produce as dark a stain as the coffee. I even tried steeping the tea for longer, around 10 minutes, again using only 1 bag to 1 cup of water. And I still didn't notice much of a difference once the paper was dry. I realized at the end of my little experiment that it was easier and less messy to paint the coffee or tea stain directly onto the paper instead of pouring it on. And depending on if you painted on one or both sides, you could have one side of the paper darker than the other. I also just had fun combining the coffee and tea until I had a large stack of aged paper. But what, I wonder, could I possibly do with all this DIY ancient paper? Well, you better hit that subscribe button to find out. My name is Pam, and this is Total Pamarchy, the craft channel with a little anarchy. Until next time, bye!
Caesar, can you watch out? Caesar, can you watch out? What shall we make next, me pretties?